I guess soil erosion as an issue has been an ongoing one that we've had across Alberta dating back to the beginning of farming in the area.
It's a combination of multiple factors. Some of it can be in rotation of different crops. Some of it can be the type of winter we're having. You know, if we have that freeze-thaw cycle, if we have no snow cover, if we're dry going into the fall. There's a lot of factors that come into play.
Most of the time we use extension or education as the first step on dealing with soil erosion, because it's difficult to stop soil erosion as it's happening. It's a lot easier and economical to prevent soil erosion from happening.
For us, it's pretty important that the soil doesn't blow. Like, we grow potatoes in a fully no-till grain rotation, so potatoes is the only crop that requires tillage because the potatoes need mellow soil so we can actually dig them. We're trying to incorporate the cover crops as much as we can with the potatoes. Right now, the cover crops mainly consist about fall crops like winter wheat right after the potatoes, or a barley crop before the potatoes that dies off with the frost, so that we don't use any chemical application to terminate the crop. The nice thing about that is that we incorporate all that straw into the hills next year, which gives us really nice aerated hills, which is actually a benefit for the potatoes. The struggle that we would have is if we had a really wet spring and we had a really tall cover crop in the fall, is to rototill that in. That's something we might run into. That could be a challenge.
What we have here is we have hybrid fall rye and winter wheat. We use them both for winter cereals to protect the land over our winters. Hybrid fall rye produces a lot more cover. It's more vigorous. It can grow when it's a little bit even cooler. Just to see, these were seeded on the same date, and we got, this is on my left here. This would be hybrid fall rye, one seed, and this would be winter wheat. So we're looking at almost double the growth. Hybrid fall rye, you seed at half the rate. So I guess advantages on the winter wheat side is that we're actually getting more plants, but they're not as big.
Something that I've noticed over the last couple of years that we've implemented these cover crops, that because all that organic matter is in the dirt, the hills hold the moisture better. And if you got more moisture in your hill, the temperature seems to be more consistent and the canopy closes faster. The benefit of that is a more even product.
Increasing soil organic matter from 1 to 3% reduces that soil's erodibility by 20 to 30%. It helps as a glue between soil particles. So it really comes down to water holding capacity. If the soil can hold more water, it's stronger and less susceptible to wind erosion.
In the last few years, we had a lot of winters with lots of temperature swings with the freeze-thaw cycles and make the ground really mellow and prone to blowing. A lot of us have implemented cover crops in various ways. Like, people have seeded it before crop was harvested. People have seeded it right after, have seeded it in between the swaths. I think big steps have been made in the last few years.
Cover crops work really well when we're doing dry beans and we're harvesting early, or potatoes and we're harvesting early. But once we're harvesting into October, cover crops can't be used anymore. We have to rely on other methods to control our land. And mostly that is ripping. So we'll rip the land deep, aggressively, and try to make lumps that will dry and will last all winter.
Some of the specialty crops are a little more difficult. They're very long season crops. The crop starts early in the spring. You're seeding in mid-April or late April, but some of our harvest doesn't get off till almost November. And for example, sugar beet, there's no stubble. It is pure dirt, and a lot of times we're harvesting in the snow and we can't put a cover crop in to get established to give us a little protection.
Another technique that we use during the season is a process called dammer diking, which is reservoir tillage. It's a machine that goes in between the hills and it rips up the compacted dirt in between the hills, makes pockets in between the hills that prevent the water from running down. That is not just rainwater, like for heavy storms, but also irrigation. But we try to use our tillage in our advantage too. Like, right after planting, we come back and we try to make nice and smooth hills which crust up. But if we make it nice and crusty, then the winds can get a grip on the hills, and those crusted up hills will barely ever blow.
It can be challenging if you work the land and all of a sudden you get some rain and a frost mixed together, freezing rain. Water will go into the lumps, shatter the lumps. We're left with powder. Winter comes after that. There's not much we can do.
Another technique that we use is very basic. We make all our hills in the north-south direction, so they're in the opposite direction of the wind.
It's just kind of using what you have and to help combat it, yeah.
The biggest area we see soil erosion now is on irrigated fields on specialty crops. Potatoes, sugar beets, things like that. There's not a lot left in the soil, so those are the ones we're seeing that are blowing primarily from November until early spring and the March is where we get most of our soil erosion events.
So generally speaking, when we're talking about soil erosion, we look at an acceptable amount. There's always going to be a little bit of soil movement. It's being driven by several different factors: the topography, the soil aggregatability, the land cover, the practices being committed on the land, and of course weather intensity. So wind erosion, high wind speeds causing soil particles to start tumbling. Eventually they start bouncing as wind speeds increase, and then eventually they become like in an aerosol, so particles being carried away. We try to keep that loss to a very minimum. We're looking at less than 5 tons per acre per year, which is 0.03 of an inch. We have to break up that wind speed, and basically a 30-mile-per-hour wind is 3 times more erosive than a 20-mile-per-hour wind. As wind speed increases, the impacts of it increases exponentially.
So when there's an erosion event, you can hear it out our window. You look outside and there's land on the move. So we'll separate a couple of county employees and go to each end of the county and start documenting land that's moving. We'll make phone calls to the affected producers. Often we're requesting them to go out with a cultivator with spikes and work the land, leave spaces in between, and then do another cultivation. And that often you can bring a wind event on a quarter section under control in under 45 minutes.
When we went through our policy, what we did was we outlined 4 or 5 different tactics that producers have used locally and with some success. When we're having those conversations, we're having very consistent conversations with each individual landowner about the things that may or may not work on their field.
As a dryland farmer, soil erosion's always on our mind. In the 30s here, the land blew bad, and on all the section fence lines here, there's 2 or 3 feet of black dirt. That's our biggest reason to spread manures, to bring the nutrients back up in the soil.
Back in '76, my father-in-law, Ron Svains, he started doing test plots with zero till. Then I think it was about 1986 is when he started doing, on kind of a limited scale across his farm, zero till. And then he did that till 1994 and then started going full out zero till on the farm. And I would have come onto the farm back in 2000. Back then we got into disc drills, and then we've only been using the stripper straw for the past 2 years. Close neighbor, he was doing it for quite a few years, and we could see the benefits with it.
Quite a different techniques used on dry land. Leaving your stubble on in the fall is a big thing. The cover from the previous year protects the new crop going into the next year. That fixes erosion almost 100%. And a lot of this new equipment we have too hardly disturb the soil when you do go in the spring. A lot of the header systems we use, like the stripper headers, leave a lot more stubble compared to a traditional draper type header or a reel type header. Just the equipment itself is night and day. And a lot of it is geared toward preventing soil erosion and zero-till farming.
I grew up on a purely crop farm that got into cattle for many years, but there were a lot of mixed farms around us that got out of cattle and stayed just in crop, and so they lost that manure resource as a tool, either feeding cattle in the field or spreading manure in the field to add to soil tilth, to add that organic material back to the soil.
On our farm, we try to keep it a closed loop. We grow feed. We feed our cattle our own feed. We take the manure from our cattle and we spread it on our farm to try to keep this loop as tight as possible. To me, manure is worth at least $1,000 an acre every time you put it on. It's improving our farm that much.
On sugar beets, one option is to put manure on after the crop's been off. The manure tends to have a little more lumps, and that sometimes is enough to hold the soil through the fall and through the winter.
The manure program that we have on the farm will only be used on the fields that are harvested last. The first ones we try to put a cover crop on, but the last ones we won't have enough time to establish a successful cover crop, and that's where we use the manure from.
It's always easier to prevent erosion than there is to address it. If erosion events are happening, there are a few things that we can do from an emergency point of view. Manure, 20 to 30 tons to the acre. We want a good cover and spread it on. We're not working it in. In Alberta, all manures actually are supposed to be worked in within 48 hours. We need to talk to the NRCB, the Natural Resources Conservation Board, to work with them, and they've been really good in the past, waiving that requirement of incorporation if it's to prevent erosion.
In the last couple of years, the NRCB has experienced an increased interest in operators or landowners wanting to utilize manure as a soil wind erosion control measure. If people want to use manure as a wind erosion control measure, there's a few things we'd like to make them aware of. If you're spreading manure on land that is not frozen and you're not incorporating it, then there's some setback distances that must be adhered to. One is 150 meters from any neighboring residences. The second is 30 meters from a common body of water. And that increases as the slope of the land towards that water body increases up to about 12%. At 12%, then manure application is not allowed. The other requirement is that you must keep records of your manure spreading activities and your soil test results. Also, the land where the manure is going to be applied cannot have received fertilizer or manure in the previous 7 months. If operators want to apply, or landowners want to apply manure during the winter, so when the land is frozen or snow covered, then there's some other additional requirements. So the definition of frozen land would be the top 6 inches of the soil is impenetrable. So you jump on a shovel, it doesn't go in the ground. So our definition of snow-covered land is when there's greater than 2 inches of snow covering greater than 50% of the field. If those are the conditions that exist, then you need permission from the NRCB inspector before you can apply the manure on that land. The inspector will come out and look at the field where you want to apply on, and what they're basically looking for is the topography, the slope of the land, the distance to any common bodies of water, and they're just assessing any potential risks if surface runoff issues do happen. The distance to a common body of water are double what I stated before, so it's not 30 meters, it's 60 meters, and then that increases as the slope of the land increases. There may also be a requirement for setbacks from drainage ditches that lead off the property, and that could include roadside ditches.
When county infrastructure or municipal infrastructure is impacted by land blowing, it's now the landowner's responsibility to remove that soil from the infrastructure. So when we think of a couple years ago, we were working with about 42 different landowners that had to do, varying levels of removing the soil from the ditch and putting it back onto their fields where it came from.
So if operators want to spread manure on frozen or snow-covered land, you must contact the NRCB regional office in your area. If this happens after hours, or if it's an emergency, you can phone the NRCB's 24-hour response line, and that number is 1-866-383-6722. We also have numerous guidelines and fact sheets on our website, including the one for spreading on frozen snow-covered land, and that website is www.nrcb.ca.